And shalom to all those who are here, and shalom to all those who are listening to this recording, both its video recording and also our classes, or at least some of our classes, are now available on Spotify. So I believe that this class, and I know some of my previous ones, are now available on Spotify or any other streaming platform. So please feel free to indulge in that opportunity. If you're traveling, there's always an opportunity to do a bit of learning from one place to another. That's point number one. Point number two, for those who I've yet to meet, my name is Johnny Solomon. I was recently appointed the Chief Learning Officer at WebYeshiva, and while I teach some classes and try and work with the team in terms of thinking about new opportunities, an opportunity that I've brought to WebYeshiva, which is online spiritual coaching and halachic consultation services, which are now able to be booked exclusively through WebYeshiva at our website. And you can book a free discovery call if you want to understand a little bit more what that's about, or look on our website, and there's a number of FAQs, frequently answered questions. Now, having established that, I'm going to now share my PowerPoint. I hope you can see that. And the title of this session is Pesach Cleaning, Hashkafot in the Halachot, which perhaps sounds like a somewhat ambiguous topic. We're going to explain it, and we're going to work through some ideas. And hopefully this should, trigger some thoughts, inspire some further reflections, and give us meaning as we scrub away for those who are going to be indulging themselves in the next couple of weeks to clean for Pesach, which way you do so. But before we actually get into the dinim, the laws of cleaning for Pesach, I actually want to talk about the subtitle, Hashkafot in the Halachot. Hashkafot means outlook, Halachot means Jewish law. And so basically by simply using this title, I've made a claim, which is that there are spiritual outlooks that can be drawn from religious practices, perhaps even if those religious practices don't themselves explicitly state some kind of spiritual outlook. Now, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, whenever it lists certain halachot, it doesn't always say, this is why we do what we do. Sometimes it's drawing from other sources which give us those reasons. And sometimes those sources themselves don't give us a reason. I'm a strong believer that in almost every area of Jewish law, there are Jewish values underpinning those Jewish laws, and those Jewish values are reflective of a Jewish outlook, which means there are hashkafot that can be derived from almost every area of halacha. Now, some Jewish thinkers have endeavored to crystallize those hashkafot in the halachot. And one of the sources we're going to be looking at in today's session is Rabbi Eliezer Melamad's Peninei Halacha, which you may well have heard of, which is a whole series of halacha books, but embedded in those books are attempts to try and make sense of the Jewish outlook and Jewish values which are reflected in those Jewish laws. Now, the bonus, by the way, of Eliezer Melamad's Peninei Halacha is that not only are all of his Hebrew books available for free online to read as text, but also he's translated a number of those volumes, and all of those are available online. So the volume of Peninei Halacha on Hilchot Pesach, on the laws of Pesach, is available both in English and in Hebrew for free online through his website. And why do I mention that? Because we're going to look at his book right now. So before we get into the halachot of Pesach, I want to talk about the hashkafot of Pesach, the outlooks of Pesach, and he's going to offer some thoughts, and then he presents some laws, and then he tries to tie them together. We're not here just reading Eliezer Melamad's Peninei Halacha. Instead, we're being inspired by some of his opening insights. Then we're going to look through a range of halachot, and then I'm going to hopefully share some different ways in which I see these laws. I'm going to share how I see these laws as conveying values and messages and outlooks to do with being a Jew, or to do with spirituality, or to do with Pesach itself. So let's begin with the opening chapter of Eliezer Melamad's Peninei Halacha on Hilchot Pesach. And he begins by saying, I'm going to read the English, but this English is also provided on the website, Israel and Egypt are diametrically opposed. Egypt was an extremely materialistic society with a pagan worldview. Israel, meaning the Jewish people, on the other hand, is unique with its spiritual and abstract worldview. Thus, only Israel was able to accept the abstract belief in one incorporeal or non-physical God. Consequently, Israel's relationship to the material world is also pure and refined. Now, this statement may seem to have very little to do with Hilchot Pesach, the laws of Pesach, or the laws of cleaning for Pesach. We're going to see that it actually has quite a lot to say. What he's telling us here is when the Jewish people were in Egypt, there was a clash of cultures. Sure, we hadn't yet been given the Torah, but of course, we are still the children of the patriarchs and matriarchs who had a relationship with the one God. Abraham discovered, if often we use that phrase, God, the one God, and he taught that to his children and grandchildren, and so to Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. And it was those descendants who then came to Egypt. So already the Jewish nation, Bnei Israel, are monotheists when they come to Egypt. Now, who are the Egyptians? They don't believe in a singular soul, one God who rules all things. As we well know, Pharaoh himself sees himself as a god, and there are many other gods in Egypt. We talk about the Korban Pesach as being one of the Egyptian gods. Now, what is that connection to the laws of Pesach? It means that to understand what it means to be an Israelite in Egypt forces us to ask ourselves how our faith as Israelites differed from the Egyptian faith. And as Rabbi Melamed is explaining, that's reflected in how we see things. They saw things as possibly objects of worship. We saw things as being pure and refined, and not objects of worship, instead, creations of the singular God. Now, as we well know, Pesach requires us to engage in lots of things, foods, and in terms of Pesach cleaning, engage of lots of things, looking around our house for chametz and burning the chametz. There are lots of physical activities. But maybe, which is what I'm interpreting from this remark of Rabbi Melamed, if we internalize this distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites, then how we see what we do with things itself conveys a message of value about our faith, which is in contradistinction to the Egyptian worship and the Egyptian faith. Now, so far, that's just one quote, and we're going to look at two further quotes of Rabbi Melamed. But if we see that Egypt and Israel look at material things differently because they look at God/gods in their eyes differently, then that's going to change how they relate to items, activities, products. And that's a lot of the kind of things we do for Pesach. Let's proceed and just look a little bit later on in that first chapter. Now here he's talking about the prohibition against chametz, of which it is an absolute prohibition. The Torah prohibits chametz, and it's a severe prohibition. The prohibition against chametz on Pesach is especially stringent, says Rabbi Melamed, for the Torah not only forbade eating it, but commanded that it not be seen nor found in our possession. Our sages further forbade eating any food with even the slightest amount of chametz mixed in. We're going to come back to that soon. Thus, the avoidance of chametz on Pesach is absolute. Now, what is a spiritual message of that? Now, he's now quoting from the mystical teachings, the Zohar and other teachers who draw their wisdom from the mystical writings. And he says, chametz symbolizes the impulse of pride. You may have heard this idea before, you may not. Where fermentation causes dough to rise, it looks as though the dough is inflating itself, puffing up with pride, as an arrogant person would. In contrast, matzah, which remains in its original size, as it was when God created it, symbolizes a trait of humility. Now, has any of you heard that distinction between chametz and matzah as being this difference between humility and hubris, arrogance and being humble? Is that somewhat familiar? Or is it something you've heard before?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if it's somewhat familiar, again, perhaps if not for all, but at least for some of you, the question then is, what do we do with that? Well, how about this? If you look at the story of Pesach, you have this incredibly haughty person called Pharaoh. Pharaoh is this very proud, very haughty individual. He is chametz. And so the getting rid of chametz for Pesach, not forever, but for Pesach, is reflective of this battle of values between this prideful, haughty leader who became so prideful that God hardened his heart and the Jewish nation. And if we think about things that way, then our endeavor to remove chametz isn't just because it's commanded to do so, and isn't just because of some kind of association with arrogance versus humility, which sounds interesting, but not necessarily automatically associated with Pesach's story. But then when you plug it back into the Pesach story, because Pharaoh is this haughty, prideful character, then the removal of chametz makes a lot of sense. It's not just about the law, but it's about the values. There's an outlook that we can derive when we clean for Pesach. We're trying not to be like Pharaoh. We're trying to be humble. Of course, who is the counterforce of Pharaoh? It is Moshe. And what is Moshe known as being? The humblest of all people. The humility overrides the haughty. Pesach teaches us that in terms of how we interact with chametz and matzah. Any thoughts about that just before we get to a further quote from Rabbi Melamed? Okay.
Good.
Good. Good is good. He then takes this idea just a step further, and it's important for me to know I'm just quoting excerpts from this first chapter of his book, and you can read it again, all in Hebrew, all in English, online. And for those who don't have those links, I'll happily share those with you. But he says Pesach, and especially the Seder, is designed to instill in us the fundamentals of faith. And I want to say that again. It's not designed to make you tired. It's not designed to make you mechanically clean your kitchen. It's designed to instill within us the fundamentals of faith. That the world has a creator, that he watches over his creatures, and he chose the people of Israel to reveal his name in the world. Therefore, on Pesach, the holiday geared towards imparting the fundamentals of faith, we are commanded to be extremely cautious, to avoid eating and possessing even a smidgen of chametz, which symbolizes our human aspects that must not get mixed in when we speak about the roots and foundations of faith. During the rest of the year, however, when we nurture and improve the branches that develop from these roots, chametz is allowed and even desirable. Now, if you get that, great. If not, I think it's best to probably see that in context. But what he's doing here is taking those two messages that he's mentioned so far and bringing them together. One relating to materialism and one relating to faith and pride. And he's telling us that somehow we're doing things on Pesach in order to help us gain a better relationship with things that help strengthen our faith rather than make us lose faith. Helps us understand how there is one God who creates a physical world, rather than think that all those things in that physical world are gods. So here too, this idea of reminding ourselves that God is not material, God is not physical, and that we're ridding ourselves from certain physical, puffed up, haughty things, conveys a very, very powerful message. We're trying to be mevatel and meva'er. We're trying to annul and to destroy the chametz. And in so doing, enhance us as being humble servants of the one God. Now, so far, what we've done is look at a few Hashkafot statements of Rabbi Eliezer Melamed as he introduces his Halachot of Pesach. We're not going to go back to look at Peninei Halacha. It's a great book, but you can look at that in your own time. What we're going to do is look at some various different halachot, which he mentions himself, but we're now going to go to the Shulchan Aruch. And what I want to do is touch on a range of practices done before Pesach, most of them relating to cleaning, although perhaps one might not be, and try and have a sense of what are the Hashkafot, what are the outlooks, what are the values we can derive from these things that we do in the days and weeks before Pesach. And let's begin with something which actually isn't so much related to cleaning, but it is something which we're supposed to do. In fact, it's mentioned in the first chapter of the Shulchan Aruch dealing with Pesach. You may imagine that the first chapter of the Shulchan Aruch dealing with Pesach is telling us, Chametz is bad, get rid of it. In fact, what it teaches us, here they're quoting the Ramah, is about this mitzvah called Kimcha de Pischa, literally the flour for the Passover, to make sure that poor people have food to eat for Pesach. And says the Ramah, Minhag liknot chitim lechalkan anim letzok Pesach, kol mi shadar be'ir yud bet chodesh tzarich liten hazeh. If you live in a town for 12 months, you are obliged to give to the poor of the town, and we need to make sure that those in need have what they need for Pesach. And so there are collections in communities already right now called Kimcha de Pischa, and sadly, the past 6 months have been very, very brutal, and many more people need this year. So if you're in a position to give, please do so. But let's just think from a value-based perspective about Kimcha de Pischa. Again, we're about to get into cleaning. That's going to be the majority of our analysis, but I felt it's important to mention this. When it comes to logic, if I've earned money, me giving it randomly to somebody else who I don't know doesn't seem to make any sense. Why would I give a poor person I don't know money? Surely if I believe in the value of materialism, I should gather things together. And just think about the story of Pharaoh and Yosef. Pharaoh challenges, he commands Yosef to try and build him storehouses. Pharaoh is somebody who wants to collect resources, he doesn't want to give it away. What do Jews do? We make sure to give away what we have because we know it's not really ours. And where does that stem from? Faith in God. God created the world and God created the material world. Then whatever we have is conditional on how God wants us to interact with it. If we have financial benefits, well, now all of that is ours. We are given, but we are given in order to give. And so starting the Shulchan Aruch by reminding us about the mitzvah of Kimcha de Pischa helps remind us about our relationship with the material world. What you think is yours is not yours. Because if you believe in a God, rather than worshipping these physical things, be it money, be it stone, be it anything else, then that God asks of you to use what God has created in the world for God's will. And in this case, it's kindness, chesed. So even this teaching about Kimcha de Pischa affirms our faith in God. It affirms our belief that even the money in our wallet isn't necessarily ours because we believe that God created the world. We believe what we have is on condition of what God wants us to do with what we've received. Any thoughts about that? And you see how you can see values and faith and messages and hashkafot and outlooks even in this law. Okay, I guess we're itching to get to cleaning because that's what we said the topic's about. So let's talk about cleaning. And cleaning comes in different forms. We're not just going to talk about hoovering and washing floors. When we talk about cleaning for Pesach, it often includes cleaning the car or the house, but also cleaning the kitchen, and especially cleaning the pots and pans, not just internally within the pot, but internally within the walls of the pot. Kashering utensils is part of the cleaning for Pesach. And we clean our oven, not just in a regular way, but in a very, very intensive way, because we want to make sure that there are no remnants of chametz, not just in the oven, but even in the walls of the oven, etc., etc. And I assume that most of you here are familiar with that. What I want us to do is now do a deeper dive in understanding the Hashkafot of the Halachot of Pesach, the Hashkafot of the Halachot of cleaning for Pesach. And Let's begin here. I can see the English is just cut off there, so it should say should. But there is a rule about kashering utensils for Pesach. It's discussed here in Orach Chaim Taf Nun Aleph. In fact, it's discussed throughout the whole chapter. This is just one pull-out line. Kelim shnishtamshu behem b'chamin kfi tashmitan hechsheran. Basically, we kasher pots according to the way in which they've been used. And there it talks in Taf Nun Aleph. If you've used the pot with fire, then you kasher the pot with fire, with libun. If you use the pot with water, then you kasher the pot with water, hagala. Now, before we go on, are there any words I've used that are unclear? Because we're going to do a deep dive into understanding the messages, the outlook of kashering utensils. Any questions about the words I've used or the concepts I've said so far, just on this point? Okay. There's an important rule, a klal, about kashering utensils. I've got it here in Hebrew. Kebol o kach polto. As it is absorbed, so too it is spat out. So too it's exuded. As mentioned before, if a pot absorbs food through liquid, then it is kashered through liquid. It absorbs food through fire, then it is kashered through fire. That's why there's two different ways of kashering different utensils depending on how they are used, as it says here in this statement of the Shulchan Aruch. The question then is, okay, so that's a rule, that's a halacha. What's the hashkafot of the halacha? Well, I'll tell you. It's interesting that what led us to go into Egypt? What event prompted the descent to Egypt? There's the story of Yosef, of the brothers, of the way in which they were unkind, they were jealous, right? They sold Yosef. In fact, they presumed him to be dead. The descent to Egypt began with Yosef through an act of callousness, through an act of cruelty. And what happens when they sell him? They dip his coat in blood, right? They take his coat and put it into blood and then take it to Yaakov and say, look, your son is dead. Are you aware that at the end of the story, we also dip something in blood? We dip the hyssop. We dip the hyssop in the blood of the Korban Pesach, and we put the blood around the doorpost of the houses, which is when, right, the angel of death is Pesach, basically passes over, that's the name Passover, the houses of the Israelites. The story begins with a dipping, and it ends with a dipping. It begins with a dipping of Yosef's coat, and it ends with a dipping of the hyssop. In fact, in Leila Seder, on the Seder night, we have two dippings which parallel that. We have the dipping of the karpas, which, as Rabbeinu Manoach and others have explained, is in fact a shortened version of ketonet pasim, of the coat that was given to Yosef. Karpas, at the beginning of the story of Leila Seder, it represents a ketonet pasim. And at the end, or towards the end, we dip the maror into the charoset. That too is a further dipping. Others dip other things. And that too represents that second dipping. That is, in the story of Yosef, we leave Egypt through dipping because we came into Egypt through dipping. So too in Leila Seder, we leave Egypt with the maror and the charoset because we began the story with the karpas. So when we're kashering a pot and we're thinking kabolo kach polto, I need to kasher the pot in the way in which the food has been absorbed. In fact, what we're saying is a code to do with the whole story of Pesach. We went in that way, we have to come out that way. It went in that way, it needs to come out that way. I'll say one further thought, which is the story of Yeridat Am Yisrael, the descent of the Jewish people to Egypt, began with cruelty. And so, what do we do before Pesach? We do what I mentioned just beforehand, Kimcha de Pischa. We give charity to people. We show kindness, but with what we have. And we begin the Seder with halachmanya, an invitation to those who may be hungry. We recognize that we went down as a result of cruelty, and we try and bring ourselves out by being sensitive to not being cruel. So can you see how if you're cleaning your pot for Pesach and you're thinking, Kabbalah kachpolta, I need to remove the flavor of chametz in the way it's gone in, that too can be code for what we're actually doing in the Seder night, what we're actually saying in the Haggadah, what actually takes place in the Torah from the story of Yosef till the ending of the Exodus story. Any thoughts about that? Has this given you more meaning? If you're cleaning a pot, are you now going to think of something more than this pot is really hard to clean? Anybody? White bunch tonight. Hopefully, it should give further meaning, further significance, further symbolism as you're cleaning pots for Pesach, cleaning utensils for Pesach. So that is one hashkafah from one halacha of cleaning for Pesach. Let's talk about a different halacha relating to cleaning for Pesach. Now, you may know, if you ever open up a halachic handbook, a book which tells us, guides us what to do when kashering a kitchen. Let's say you're trying to clean your kitchen surface. They may well say, don't put hot things on the surface for 24 hours before kashering the surface. Or don't use the oven for 24 hours before kashering it. Or the same with a sink. Is that familiar instruction? Have you heard that before?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So.
Yes, it's already on my it's already on my calendar.
Right. Wait the 24 hours because actually
because we only have 2 weeks left here. I gotta know which day I can't use the sink.
Right. But what's the reason for that? So actually the reason is a halachic reason, and I believe that there is a hashkafah in that halacha. When you have real food, well, if you have a piece of bread, then it can sit on your counter for 3 days. It's still a piece of bread. That's food. It's what we call in Hebrew mamashut, real substantive thing. But when you have a flavor, an absorbed flavor, be it in a counter because you've had something hot on that counter and the flavor of that hot food has been absorbed into the counter, or in an oven where the item that's been in the oven, its flavor has been absorbed into the walls of the oven or a pot, for example. So in terms of flavor, we have a rule which is after 24 hours, absorbed flavors spoil. They go stale. And therefore, they're not considered to be quite the same thing as they were 24 hours earlier. Just take a simple example. If I have hot meat and I put it in a dairy pot, well then for the next 24 hours, that pot is considered to have the flavor of real meat, which if I put dairy in there, or if I eat food which has been cooked in that pot in general, then that would be prohibited. But if after 24 hours, then that absorbed meat flavor has spoiled, it's gone stale. So if I accidentally cook in that pan, whatever I cook will be fine. So if you've ever had a question with kashrut and you call an expert or a rabbi, often the question they'd say is, did you use a pot with something hot in the last 24 hours? Or to use a fancy halachic term, is it a ben yomo or eno ben yomo? Now, why is this relevant? Because as we said, for Hilchot Pesach, in order to kasher a counter or the oven or a pot, we're generally supposed to leave it 24 hours. So this is the statement in the Shulchan Aruch saying so, where we're told, Noten tam nifka mutar gam b'Pesach. Principally, Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, says stale, spoiled flavors are permitted on Pesach. Principally, if there wasn't chametz in that pot for 24 hours and thereby the chametz flavor has now been spoiled, you'd be allowed to eat food from that pot. But then we have a statement of Rav Moshe Issa, he's the Ramah. There are people who are strict, and this is a general custom in our communities, in our countries. So, because Ashkenazim are certainly strict, given this, they basically say, wait 24 hours to make the ta'am pagum, spoilt, stale flavor, and then remove it. So there's almost a double endeavor in terms of how we kasher our utensils for Pesach when there's direct contact with food. Now, that's the halacha. Well, again, we could spend a lot more time on that halacha, but of waiting 24 hours to diminish the impact of the absorbed flavor, and then to try and remove that.
Like, does that mean that Sephardim currently have a different tradition regarding the waiting of the 24 hours?
Well, it means that, well, Maran himself says, not to tamnifka mutan gamba Pesach. Now, some people are more makpid, but that kind of instruction that we find in certain handbooks is often not found in Sephardi handbooks. I wouldn't say it's not done, and many people are very strict on Pesach, and so they go above what they call the letter of the law. But you can see there's a very, very clear disagreement here between one and the other. I'm sorry, I can see it says spoiled, but yeah, I think you get the message. Now, what's the hashkafah of this halacha? This is a halacha about ta'am pagum, which is a rule that we have about meat and milk throughout the year, and here it's things that we concern ourselves about because of the ta'am of chametz. There's a message which is, if you leave something and you don't animate it, after a while it gets spoiled, it becomes stale. That's the concept of pagum. The flip side is, if you don't leave it, if you animate it, if you engage it, if you heat it up, then it's not pagum, then it's chai, then it's live, then it's raw, then it's flavorsome, then it's meaningful. As Pesach comes along, part of the celebration of Pesach is about just tapping into the energy of what it means to be a Jew, part of the Jewish nation. And our task as Jews is to keep Judaism fresh. And I mean that in every sense of the term. Keep Judaism fresh. How do we keep our Judaism fresh? And part of it is, don't just rely on what you did a few weeks ago and hope that its flavor is still a remnant flavor in yourself. You always need to be adding more flavor. You know, if most people don't drink milk more than a few days old, why would we drink Judaism, which hasn't been kind of woken up, stirred up, shaken up, in order to speak to where we are, what we're doing in any given day? So there's a message about not in tam nifkam and tam pagum of this is how we define stale things. This is how we define spoiled things. But maybe this also teaches us how to define fresh things. And Judaism should be fresh. Just a thought. Again, especially a thought as we come to Leil HaSeder, when we try and bring some energy. I was just talking to some friends a couple of days ago. We were learning some Halachot of Pesach. And they said, people, they would, we're talking about, and they do Seder. I said, well, in my family, we do this. And I told them every year we try and do new things, but also we radically try and change the way we have the Seder. We try and do it on the couches and we sit with Haseba leaning back. And they were like, wow, that's so cool. I said, sure. Of course, you need to shake things up on Pesach. That's the whole idea, that people should ask questions. It should engage people. Pesach is when we're affirming our Jewish story and our Jewish faith. We can't just try and do the default of what we did last year. So people should not just, it's interesting. People work very, very hard to plan their cleaning for Pesach and plan their menu of Pesach. We also need to be planning our energy of Pesach, our freshness, our ideas of trying to make Leil HaSeder and the rest of Pesach engaging, to try and concretize those values, that faith that Rabbi Melamed was speaking about, those Hashkafot that are very much present in the Halachot of Pesach. Because if all we do is Halachot without Hashkafot, we're actually really missing really important aspects of what we're trying to do. We're actually we're only drawing from the halacha section of Pesach, but not the Agada, the truest sense of the term. So far, we've spoken about Kimcha de Pischa, we've spoken about Kabbalah Kachpolto, and Noten Tam Difkam. These are principles to do with cleaning for Pesach, kashering for Pesach. I want to talk about further Hashkafot in the preparation for Pesach, and this goes over 2 screens, and this has a very, very practical application. You may know people, perhaps that includes yourselves, who cook everything that they want to eat on Pesach before Pesach. Is that you, or do you know people who do that? They cook everything they're going to eat on Pesach before Pesach. Anybody's cook?
I don't know anyone like that. I don't know anyone like that.
Now, that may sound like somebody who just wants to give themselves a hard time, but there is a halachic rationale why a person may wish to do so. That doesn't mean they must, but there's a halachic rationale why they may wish to do so. And this is to do with this concept of bitul. And so let's talk about in general. In general, a classic case where you have some chicken soup and a drop of milk falls into the chicken soup, and we say, if there's 60 times the amount of chicken soup versus the milk, it's fine. I'm generalizing, but that's a broad principle, because we assume that the amount of milk that went in hasn't significantly changed the flavor of the majority of the dish. Okay, that's what we call bitul. The small amount of milk has been annulled by that 60 times the amount of meat. Okay. Now, does that rule apply on Pesach? Well, let's have a look. Let's now do some learning. It says in Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim Tov Mem Zayin, Im nit areva chametz kodem haPesach. If you're cooking before Pesach, if you're cooking your Pesach dishes, but a day or 2 or 3 before Pesach, and a bit of chametz accidentally falls into what you're doing, if it's less than the 60th, that's fine, because before Pesach, the chametz is annulled according to the rest of the dish. So you're making whatever you're making, and a tiny bit of chametz falls into your food. You may not want to, you may have an emotional reaction to that, but according to Jewish law, if there's 60 times non-chametz versus chametz, that's fine, just as much as if there's 60 times the chicken soup versus the milk, that's fine. However, if the tiniest trace of chametz falls in a dish on Pesach, no matter how much the non-chametz food is versus the amount of chametz that's fallen in, it is prohibited. The issa is, the transgression is b'mashu, right? Even the smallest amount. So bittul 60 times principle applies before Pesach. It doesn't apply on Pesach, which is why there are people who cook all the food they want to eat on Pesach before Pesach. It's not because they want to give themselves unnecessary, heartache. It's because of this principle that if, God forbid, a bit of chametz fell in, well, if they've done the mixture, the tarovet, before Pesach, then fine, and the bittul affair works. If they do it on Pesach, then the principle of nullification doesn't work. Now, just before we get to the Hashkafot of these Halachot, any questions about that, if it's unfamiliar? Any question about this? Because some seem to be less familiar with this. And these are, and we're quoting here from the Shulchan Aruch. This is normative Jewish law for everybody. Okay. So what do we learn? We learn that before Pesach, a bit of something can be absorbed and thereby lose its identity. On Pesach, a bit of something can be absorbed but doesn't lose its identity. It remains there. It's always there. Afilu b'mashahu asur. The Jewish people were a very small minority versus the Egyptians. And if we were a small minority, we should have been absorbed and assimilated. We were there for 210 years. Have you ever wondered, how come we survived? There are various midrashim that talk about the different things that Jews did to stay distinct, to stay mitzuyanim, as the Haggadah Shel Pesach says. They kept their name, they changed their clothes, they didn't speak Lashon Hara. But what does that represent? It represents the fact that we didn't allow ourselves to be annulled. Now, there's an interesting principle in Halachah called Davar Chashuv Afilu Be'elef Lo Batil. If something is an important item, then if it's mixed even with a tremendous amount of a different item, it's not annulled. So if you have a really important piece of meat and it goes in some milk, because it is a Davar Chashuv, then it's never batil, no matter how. Okay, that wouldn't work with meat and milk in that respect, but in a way, for example, you have other things of the same type, min b'mino, as they say. The Jewish people were able to stay distinct. They're able to be a goy mikerev goy because they didn't allow themselves to be batil. They didn't allow themselves to be annulled, absorbed, mixed in. Instead, they remained mutsuyanim. They remained distinct. So you have this rule about batel or bittul chametz before Pesach and on Pesach, where before Pesach bittul works, on chametz it doesn't. But this also plays into the wider story of the Jewish people who weren't annulled, who maintained their identity. And because they maintained their identity, they could be extracted from Egypt. They could be this nation from within a nation. They were able to be brought out by Moses. And that's us. That's the story of the Jewish people. Any questions or thoughts about that? Can you see how there are different Hashkafot that we can learn from these different Halachot, from the din of Bitul, the Hashkafah of not assimilating and maintaining a distinct Jewish identity. And we saw before, when we're talking about not Tim Tam Lifkam, the idea of keeping a freshness of your Judaism, and Agalat Kelim, remembering that we went into Egypt in one way and we go out in the same way with the dipping and the Kimcha de Pischa, that similarly, it teaches us about our faith, about how what we have isn't our own. So all of these different things and so much more as well are mechanisms to affirm Jewish values, Jewish outlooks, to teach us Hashkafot, not just teach us Halachot. Any questions before we get to our final example, and we'll try and do some kind of summary? Any questions about other areas of Jewish practice or other areas of cleaning? You may well say, well, that works with an oven, but how about a microwave? But some of these principles apply. Okay, so then let's talk here about Bedikat and Biur Chametz, the searching and the destruction of Chametz. We search for Chametz. Technically, we say, Oli Yudalid, on the night before Pesach, we search the house. Many committed Jews don't wait till the night of the 14th of Nisan to search their house for chametz. They've done so some days or maybe a little bit more beforehand. And what they do on the night of Bedikat Chametz is really, shall we say, the final search, having done a bunch of cleaning beforehand. It's important to know, by the way, though that may be the case, in principle, it doesn't need to be the case. If a person is time for time, they can clean on the night of the 14th of Nisan, and good for them. The amount of time that many Jews dedicate to cleaning for Pesach often way exceeds the amount of time they need to. That's for a different conversation. Still, we are told, Kodem she'atchil livdok, before you start this process of searching, which then continues on the next day with the burning of whatever you may have found, there's a blessing to be recited. Al biur chametz. A blessing recited on the destruction of the chametz. But there's something strange. We're doing the searching, but it's not a blessing for the searching. It's not a blessing for what we call the kal chamira, that annulment of any chametz you didn't find. Remember, we say anything we don't find is ka'afra da'ara, is like dust of the ground. Instead, the blessing is only on the burning. Now, there are various halachic reasons why that's the case. But what does the Torah actually ask of us for Pesach? The word is tishbotu. It should be destroyed. Does that mean you have to find every crumb? And this now brings us back to what Rabbi Melamed was saying at the beginning. Are we tasked with finding every crumb for Pesach? No. If you've done your due diligence, if you've done some looking around and you declare that anything you haven't found as being ka'afra da'ara, then that is effective. If you don't find anything in b'dikat chametz, you don't burn anything, that is effective. But why? Just think about this. In most homes, even with the bestest cleaning in the world, I'm quite sure there's a crumb somewhere. Sneaky little crumb in some corner or another. And we make this declaration that all crumbs that we couldn't find are like dust of the earth. How does that work? The short answer is it works because God says it works. Because God is the master of all the material world. And if God says through the Torah Tashbitu that we have the power to negate something through a declaration, then that something is then negated. That crumb of chametz is now like dust of the earth. Where does that come from? Our belief in God and our belief in God's oversight over all of the material world. Remember, Jews don't worship the material world. We worship God who creates the material world. The whole process of Kol Chamira is predicated on the notion, a very deep theological idea, that God gives us license to mentally transform physical things, because ultimately the physical world is only as is because God says it is, and God can say it is something different. And God says, if you so wish, if you with your heart choose to negate this chametz, then it isn't chametz. So that declaration that we say the night before Pesach and in the morning when we burn a kol chamira, that everything we find is like the dust of the earth, actually is very much expressive of what Rabbi Melamed said earlier on. Namely, it's expressive of the idea that God is the creator of the world. It is affirming our faith in God. It demonstrates our relationship to the material world as being something that God created, rather than us being a nation who worships this material world like the Egyptians did. So the more we sensitively address and apply and practice the laws of Pesach, the more we demonstrate and notice that these are reflective of deep values, deep spiritual teachings. But I want to say one further thing. How can I, in my heart, turn chametz into a dust of the earth? How can I transform such a thing? Think about what Pharaoh did. We spoke previously about how he was a very arrogant person, a prideful person, but also how God hardened his heart. Pharaoh used his heart in order to only see the bad of the Jewish people. Do you remember how the story begins? He forgets, according to one tradition, what Joseph and the Jewish people had done for him. He turns his heart to see only the negative of the Jewish nation. The story of Pesach, as we see it in the Torah, is of a king, of a pharaoh, who takes his heart to only see the flaws which don't exist, the phantom flaws of the Jewish people, to only see what they're not doing for the Egyptians. He ignores and forgets what Joseph had done for the nation. When we do bitul chametz and we say kol chamira, we say we can also use our heart to negate things. we do so in a way of trying to serve God. So, any questions just before we're going to start wrapping up now? Any question about the things we've covered regarding Bitul Chametz and Bedikat Chametz and the Kol Chamira and the heart, and us basically doing something similar to Pharaoh but for a positive reason rather than negative reason, and how we kasher our pots, and in so doing we do the Kabbalah Kachpolta, which is part of the story, meaning everything we do can relate back to parts of the story of Pesach and part of the major actors in Pesach, Pharaoh, Moshe, the humble, right, the material world, etc., etc. Any quick questions before we start wrapping up? Now, just for you to know, in a future session, which we're having, I think, next week, I'm going to be doing an online spiritual coaching session for Pesach, where we're going to be talking about how we're not meant to be angels and how we clean for Pesach. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about cleaning and practical questions. What I hope has come through from this session is that everything we do can be anchored, it can be connected back to the story. Everything we do can either be a flashback to Pharaoh in terms of the way we use our heart, or it could be a flashback about how we maintained our distinctness and we weren't nullified as a people, or how we should endeavor to have a fresh and energetic Pesach and live a life of freshness and energy as Jews, or how we kasher our pots in different ways, because how things went in is how things go out, because that's what the Pesach story is all about. And how even we begin Pesach by being sensitive to others and giving our own money because it's not ours, because God created the world. And we believe in God who created the world. So I think we're going to wrap up now. It's been a lot of fun going through these ideas with you. As mentioned, if you wish to look more through Rabbi Malamed's teachings about Hashkafot and Halacha, you can look online for the Penina Halacha website and then toggle to the English translation if you wish to have the English, or the Hebrew if you wish to have the Hebrew. If you have any specific questions for me, feel free to email me. I wrote to you with my email address earlier today. If you like the presentation, I'll be happy to send that to you. Please let me know and I'll gladly do that. And I look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Don't forget, Web Yeshiva providing a whole range of sessions ahead of Pesach every day, 2 sessions, 2 classes. So please book, please enjoy. And I wish you well. I wish you a great day. Look after yourselves. Thank you for joining, and take care.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Aaron, in answer to your question, yes, it is under Web Yeshiva, the Spotify account. So if you go there, there are classes from Rabbi Robin, the Rabbi Geller, Tamara Spitz, and myself, and not all the classes, but some of them, and we're trying to add more soon. Do you have any other questions?
Very much. Good Chodesh.
Good Chodesh, Chodesh Tov. Thank you so much.
Chodesh Tov.
Absolutely. We should have a good month. Should be well. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.